Welcome to today's session, Authenticating Users in JavaScript Apps with MSAL. And thank you for tuning in. This has been a really popular topic. We've run this one a few times. Looks like we've already got about 100 folks in the audience. And so I'll just let our instructor, Sydney Andrews, get to it. Thank you, Sydney.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Hey, welcome, everybody. This is the first part in a four-part series on using MSAL.js with our JavaScript applications. I'm going to share my screen real quick. So today's session, we're going to start off by learning how to authenticate users in JavaScript applications with MSAL.js. It's the cornerstone of everything we're going to talk about throughout this entire series. So if there's one session you're going to attend, that would be today's session, where we talk about the Microsoft Identity Platform, how to authenticate to it, how to get a token from it, and how to connect to another service from here. This is a four-part series, so we're going to take everything that we learned today and build upon it in the next 3 parts of this series. Before I get started breaking down like the different parts of the series and our topic for today, just a really quick housekeeping. My name is Sydney Andrews. I'm an Azure MVP, and I specialize in talking about dev topics on Azure. I'm going to try to answer as many questions as possible using our Q&A, but if you come up with a question after the series is over, or maybe you try a hands-on exercise, or you try a demo and you say, I have some more questions, or maybe something didn't seem quite right with me, msusdev@microsoft.com. Once again, that's msusdev@microsoft.com. That's our email. Feel free to shoot us an email. We try to answer questions. I know Matt in the beginning, he probably had, I know I have one outstanding question I need to address from our last series, but we do try to do a good job of answering questions. And if we can't answer your question, we'll get you to somebody who can. We, again, want to help out as much as possible. Now, I walked through a lot of demos in this series. So we have a GitHub repo, github.com, msusdev, Microsoft Identity Platform Dev. That's with quite a few underscores, and I have not put that in the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this link, or just click on it and put it in the Q&A. So if you haven't looked, we have our Q&A panel. I'll put the link to GitHub. We're going to record every episode in this series, so all 4 of our sessions. And we're going to put all of them up on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Microsoft Dev Radio. I believe Matt's already put that up. Yep, he put that in the Q&A, that we will be recording this and putting this up on YouTube. So if you need to go back and rewatch the video because I did something, you don't, you're like, hey, what did he do in that exact step? Or if you missed a session and you want to go back and look at sessions, we have all of that on our YouTube channel. All right. So there's 4 parts in this series, and today we're at the first step out of 4. Today we're going to focus on MSAL.js and just getting the fundamentals of authenticating users to the Microsoft Identity Platform. After today, we're going to move on to the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, which is a really great toolkit with built-in components. Specifically, we're going to look at some of the React components, but built-in components that allow us to use the Microsoft Graph without having to write our MSAL.js code manually. Then we're going to go back to writing our MSAL.js code manually and talk about connecting to and authenticating against Azure services. So, for example, grabbing a token for MSAL.js. Instead of going to the graph, which is always a fun demo, we'll go to something like maybe Azure Cosmos DB or Azure Storage. And then after that, we'll look at the Graph SDK for JavaScript, which builds upon everything we've learned on and how we can actually manipulate and access the graph using the Graph SDK instead of using the raw URI. So a lot of stuff we'll cover. All of it, as you can probably tell already, is pretty related to each other, so it's going to be kind of great. All right, 4 things I want to accomplish today. First, I'm going to try to answer the question, what is the Microsoft Identity Platform? I'm really excited to go in, talk about what it is, talk about the value prop and how it can be beneficial to you as a developer who is building applications that want to integrate with this identity investment that your organization has already made. After that, we'll talk about authenticating manually. We're going to use a web browser and Postman, and we are going to authenticate using that so that we understand the core components of authentication in Microsoft Identity Platform. And that's going to make it easier because then when we get to the Microsoft Authentication Library or MSAL, it's not such a mystery of how the MSAL works. We'll load up the MSAL.js library. We'll build a really simple web application using vanilla JavaScript. And then what we'll do for this web application is we will just use the MSAL.js library to go get a token, go to graph, and then since it's my account, I'll pull my profile down so you can see the very basic components of authenticating. Everything you see today, we'll build upon that in future sessions, but that all in and of itself is a pretty full day. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's talk about identity development with Microsoft Identity Platform. And so we have two goals. It's two really big overarching forest from the tree goals today. The first one is to authenticate manually. We're going to learn the components of authenticating. We're going to learn how these URLs that you see all the time when you log into Microsoft services or third-party services or the Azure portal, how these login.microsoftonline.com URLs are built and where did they come from and what do they mean? We'll walk through all of that. And then once we have mastered authenticating manually, we will use the MSAL library to do all that, but just in a nicer code-based way. So one of the slides I like to show, and I think this sets a lot of context, what we're going to talk about today is, like, how does identity fit into the context of our applications? And so I saw this slide title at a conference session, a Microsoft conference session years ago at this point, and it's still stuck with me. This concept of identity as a control plane. See, we connect to lots of different services in the cloud, in our organization, even when we connect to people within the organization. So for example, if we're emailing our clients, if we're emailing our vendors, if we're messaging other employees in our organization, if we're emailing other employees in our organization, if we're sharing files between employees within our organization, if we have devices and that we have to use this device or log into this device as part of our workflow or day-to-day job, or even, sometimes from a recreational aspect. Everything on this right-hand side of this slide is just ways that our identity is ingrained into all these applications we use, because identity is this control plane of everything that we do with these spread out services. And this also goes to the left side of this slide, where we think we more commonly think of identity when we think about our on-premise applications, our cloud applications. And the question is always I have an application and I want to add authentication with all my organizational identities that we already have in Azure Active Directory. How do I do that? And that's usually that question that drums up this whole conversation within the organization. The answer really is that you kind of already have identity ingrained into many different things within your organization. So it's not as much of a complex leap as you think it would be, because the teams, whether they're teams of third-party companies, teams at Microsoft, or maybe other teams within your organization, have been integrating identity for years. So the SDKs and libraries for this have gotten better and better, to the point that we're now at the Microsoft Identity Platform, which I believe is the easiest on-ramp to adding identity to your application. So let's talk about that on-ramp and that complexity. So we have Azure Active Directory, and this is really an identity service. I always like to say Azure Active Directory is not Active Directory in the cloud, but rather identity service that has a lot of features in common with what we think of as Active Directory. But if we put those things like domain controllers, all that stuff, put that stuff out of your mind and just think of Azure Active Directory as an identity provider. And you've ran into identity providers before. If you've used a social media site, and logged in using your social media credentials to another website, you're using identity providers. If your organization makes an investment in other types of clouds that tend to have their own identity platforms, using their identity provider. So this idea, Azure Active Directory is an identity provider, and it provides identity services to many different applications, whether they're applications running in the Microsoft cloud. So we think of the Microsoft 365, Azure. If they're identity to devices that we typically use for our work, whether they're tablets, laptops, desktop computers, even servers, identity to our own premises applications, and identities to our cloud applications, again, whether they're applications that were built by Microsoft, applications built by somebody else, or even applications built by ourselves. This identity provider, Azure Active Directory, is providing identity as a service using well-known standards. So for a long time, there was a library to work with Azure Active Directory, and it was pretty good, but it was still pretty complex. And if you were new to the platform, it could be very daunting. I remember my very first time looking at Active Directory Authentication, ADAL, sample code for working with ADAL, and it was extremely complex, and it was very tightly integrated with authenticating to Azure Active Directory at a very special Azure AD endpoint, and that was the one lane you could stay in. Couldn't use it for any other purpose. So it's really hard as an organization to invest in building an application using this library, because you're essentially locking yourself into authenticating using only one method, using and while it still used open protocols and stuff, it was still very much a locked in, lockstep thing. And there wasn't a lot of flexibility in your identity. You had to have identities within your directory. It was all sorts of crazy stuff. So eventually, this idea came along of maybe a more comprehensive or holistic platform from identity that includes a set of SDKs and libraries and practices for authenticating that's common amongst all the types of identities that you're going to use and identity providers that you will use in your solutions, and not just Azure Active Directory, but maybe identities that you're using with Azure Active Directory B2C, where you have your users log in using their social identities, which is a different identity provider. Maybe you have identities within your own organization. Maybe you have identities within a cloud. The idea with the Microsoft Identity Platform was to create one API, one SDK surface that you use for all of this, that's just configurable, instead of creating 6 or 7 different SDKs or libraries for each different one. You write your code once, and you just change your configuration depending on what identity providers you choose to use as an organization. The idea here is that you have one set of development tools for all Microsoft identities. So the identity platform tend to be referred to as 2.0. And the idea is that with this identity platform 2.0, we now have the Microsoft Authentication Library. Remember, I talked about how it has unified SDKs and libraries that can connect to the Microsoft Identity Platform endpoint. So everything's labeled 2.0, so you know, hey, we're connected to Microsoft Identity Platform. This is more of the unified, holistic approach. And then the types of accounts we connect to they're a matter of configuration and setup, not so much a matter of us changing our code. So the interesting thing here is that my MSAL level code, my code that interact with the MSAL library, pretty much stays the same. But my configuration changes if I want to authenticate using work or school accounts. That's what we tend to think of as our organizational accounts in Azure AD. Or maybe we want to use our consumer accounts, our Microsoft accounts. Maybe this is an application that's integrated into Xbox. And people are not using organizational work accounts with Xbox, but they're rather using personal Microsoft accounts. Maybe we want to write code that works with Azure AD B2C, where we have people using their own social and identity providers from different social media sites. The cool thing here is that our MSAL code, the way we access the endpoint, that's all the same, because it's one approach, one holistic way to write your code. So if we wanted to get started with the identity platform, essentially the best place to go is to docs.com, that's docs.com. This will take us to the landing page for Microsoft documentation. I'm going to go ahead and select Azure. I'm going to roll a dice. Usually I go straight to a URL, but I'm going to roll a dice and pull this up manually. And then we're going to, from the list of Azure products, I'm going to filter down to identity products. There's Azure Active Directory. I'm going to select that. This is the documentation for Azure Active Directory. That's good. But if I'm a developer, I really want to get down to documentation about the Microsoft Identity Platform. And I can go down to this section for Microsoft Identity Platform and select See More. And this will take me to the landing page for Microsoft Identity Platform documentation. I'm going to put this link in the Q&A, but essentially it's docs.microsoft.com /Azure/Active Directory/develop. This is the developer landing page. This is once you start building applications against Microsoft Identity Platform, this is where you're going to live. Tons of sample code, tons of conceptual breakdowns. Especially if you've never, as an organization, you're trying to standardize and teach other people the language and basics, like what's the difference between authentication and authorization, what is a security token, all sorts of cool things like that is available here as conceptual documentation. The great thing about this is that that landing page I just gave you, I'm going to go right back to it, also has examples of different types of applications in different languages. It's not all just .NET, lots of JavaScript examples, which we're going to heavily focus on in this series. And you're also going to notice as you dig into this a little bit, a lot of the samples I'm showing you are derived, slightly changed because we like to have fun, but derived specifically from this documentation page. And that's by design. I want you to be able to go to this documentation page, see something in documentation is like, oh, that's what they were doing in the webinar. That's completely intentional. The biggest thing I wanted to call out here is that there is I find it up here. There's a video learning series where you can actually dig into different videos about the Microsoft Identity Platform, authentication, all sorts of great stuff. So again, we have this webinar series. I hope you attend all 4 sessions, but that doesn't mean that has to be the end of your learning journey. Lots and lots of great stuff here. We also have lots of sample applications. And then the last thing I want to show was there is a code samples list. So based upon your language, if you just want to see a list of all code samples that are available, they got that for you too. And that's all of these code samples on GitHub. So it's kind of great. You can pull down those code samples, take a look and see how the product team has implemented their examples that they use in the documentation. So lots of stuff here. I always like to show that first before we get into any hands-on demos, because a lot of people ask, where can I read more documentation? That's where it is. So let's have some fun. Let's talk about authenticating to Microsoft Identity Platform. So the very first thing we have to do is we have to register our AAD application. Now, this is where we get access to all the stuff we need. So being able to authenticate against the Microsoft Identity Platform, be able to get a token, use that authorization token or bearer token to access different services, whether it's a service like the Microsoft Graph, or whether it's a service like another Azure service, or even if it's an API that you stand up, but you support Microsoft Identity Platform, so people can go to Identity Platform and get a token to access your service. The idea here is that no matter what, if an application needs tokens, it needs to support authentication, it needs to be registered in Azure Active Directory. Now, when you register this application, typically you include a redirect URI so that when somebody's sent to this application to go and authenticate, or when somebody's sent to Azure AD to go authenticate, once it's done, where are we sending them back? And of course, there's some checking along the way to make sure that the redirect URI that you pre-registered in advance matches with the one that you're specifying in your client application, all that fun stuff. Now, once you register, you get a set of client credentials, and we'll use that to, set up authentication. One of the interesting things is you can register different types of applications. These are sometimes referred to platforms. I might update this slide one day, but I like saying application type, so we'll stick with that for just today. We have our different, more common ones that you would think of, like a backend web API or a front-end web application. Maybe it's a desktop, mobile, a native client-side application, or maybe it's a server-side application with no user interaction whatsoever. Those are the ones that is most common that you think of. The other application type that might be interesting is a single page application. This is very interesting if you're doing JavaScript development, because these are the type of applications where everything's running on a single page, and it requires just a little bit more nuance when setting up authentication, because we're essentially taking a single page application and adding either a pop-up or redirect. So that there's a little bit more the word escapes me, but a little bit more configuration there. And so they have a special application type for that. So let's register our first application, Azure AD. I'm going to open up this browser. I have the Azure portal open, and I'm going to go to Azure Active Directory. Now, if you don't have this under your list of Azure services, this happens. This tends to be like your most recent choices. A couple ways you can do this. You can click More Services, and I'll take you to a list of all your services, filter down to identity, and select Azure Active Directory. The other way you can do it is just search for Azure Active Directory using the search bar. However you do it, it's going to take you to your directory. And this is where you can configure different users, groups, all the things you normally do in Azure AD. But today specifically, we're going to create an application registration. Now, a question that almost always comes with the Q&A is, hey, do I have to give somebody, really high-level access to my Azure Active Directory to register application? No, you can actually configure using role-based access control. I know it's beyond the scope of today's webinar series, but you can configure a user to only have permission to either read application registrations or create them. So you can have a situation where developers on your team can register applications while they're doing dev or testing, or maybe view existing application registrations. Maybe you have a ops team that needs to be able to view the application registrations but not manipulate them. You can configure all of that using role-based access control. So you don't have to give somebody total permission over your directory just to register an application. That's something I very commonly do. All right, so we list our application registrations. I don't have any, so I'm going to create one. I'm going to select new registration. Now from here, I'm going to give it a name. I don't know why it has all this follow-up stuff, but we'll give it a name. We'll call it MS Dev. And if one of the things we're going to configure is this types of accounts I want to support. Now, this is really interesting because by default, this first option is only accounts in my organizational directory. So this is called a single tenant application. Only my current tenant and its unique user, unique ID, which is a GUID, will be supported by this application registration. So if somebody else tries to log in and they're not part of my tenant, they're not going to be able to log in. Now I can make this a multi-tenant application, same concept. It has to be a work or school or organizational, that's the official term, account. However, it can be part of any directory, not just my directory. Multi-tenant applications are interesting because they start with a common login screen, and then once the person puts in their email or alias, then it navigates to the branded or very specific login screen for that organization, any other configuration that organization has done. So the cool thing here is I'm creating this application registration, but this doesn't impact how any specific organization handles their login experience. If their login experience requires you to connect to, I don't know, an HTML page on a machine running in the server closet back in their home office, that's just part of their login experience. If their login experience is highly branded, like I've done a ton of branding with mine, then that's the login experience they're going to get in a multi-tenant application. Two other choices. You can include both multi-tenant support and support for personal Microsoft accounts. That one's pretty self-explanatory. This pretty much means any Microsoft identity. And the last one is just personal Microsoft accounts only. So if you have a situation like an Xbox situation where it only supports personal Microsoft accounts, you may only want to set up your application registration to support that. So these are your four options. Today, we're going to allow any organizational directory. So we'll make this a multi-tenant application, but only supporting organizational accounts. Now, for application type, we're going to select public client native because I'm going to just do this all manually. So I have my public client native application, and I'm going to say my redirect URI is localhost, HTTP localhost. Once I'm done, I'm going to hit register, and now I've created an application registration. And that's pretty much everything I need. I have my client ID, which is a unique ID for this application registration. I will need that when I authenticate. I also have my tenant ID. So if I'm ever setting up login, but I want to go straight to maybe my tenant's login page or some other experience, I will need the unique ID from my Azure Active Directory tenant. That's my tenant ID. From here, there's other stuff that we're going to configure, but one thing I want to call out right now is that by default, if I jump in to API permissions, I see that there's only one permission set up, and that's to the Microsoft Graph to read my user profile. Microsoft Graph user.read. Now, in further episode or further sessions in this series, we'll walk through adding additional permissions and configuring permissions and admin consent, all that fun stuff. We can add permissions to different services in Azure. Like for instance, I want to give you permission to access Azure Cosmos DB or access Azure Storage. We can configure all of that. But today, we're only going to read information from the graph. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about what the graph is when we get closer to that. But so this is the only permission I need. I'm only going to read my own profile for the Microsoft graph. So user.read, perfect. All right, jumping back into the slides. There are multiple authentication flows that are supported by Microsoft Identity Platform. Now, the cool thing about this is that we're not going to go over all of them. Essentially, we're going to focus on one or two, but there's quite a few, and they all support different situations where we want to have a different login experience. So for example, let's say we have our really normal login flow. The user clicks a button and we have an interactive login experience. We can do that. We can have login experience integrated into Windows, where it uses the existing Windows identity, especially if they're used, especially since modern Windows OS supports both personal accounts, organizational accounts. We can have username, password. We can do on behalf of, which is really interesting if you have a situation like you have an API and your front end handles the interactive login experience. And then the API calls the service on behalf of a different user. We have client credentials where we can run applications without user interaction by using either certificates or other type of credential objects. And we also have one that I really like called device code, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. So let's walk through some of these authentication flows. So interactive authentication flow is the one you're going to see most often. This is super simple. An application is set up and the user needs to log in. So that application sends the user to login.microsoftonline.com. That's essentially hosted for Azure AD. And then the user logs in. Once they log in, a token is sent back to the application. And then that application, because it trusts Azure AD, will use that token to go, the application will use that token to go to Microsoft Graph. And because Microsoft Graph trusts bearer tokens generated by Azure AD, you'll be able to access Microsoft Graph using that token. Super simple workflow, nothing too crazy here. But just because I like to have fun, I like to give you a taste of the future. There are more complex authorization flows. For example, device code flow. This one's really fun. Imagine you have a device or application is running where maybe you can see the console or some type of display or output, but you don't have any way of interacting. One example I always give is IoT devices that have a screen, but you don't have access to a keyboard. Well, during the login experience, that application can generate a code. And this unique code can be used by this unique device code can be used to set up authentication. So for the user, they will go to some type of workstation, laptop, desktop, whatever it may be. They will log in from there to Azure AD. And then once they log to Azure AD, the IoT app, since it has that same unique device code, it will receive the credentials and then it will be able to access such services such as the Microsoft Graph or Storage or Azure Cosmos using the credentials. So this is a really great way to allow interactive login in a situation where the actual device that needs the token or doesn't have interactivity. So it's pretty cool. You see this a lot. If you use the Azure CLI, then you've probably seen the device code flow in action. So all requests go to this one base URL. That's login.microsoftonline.com / your tenant ID / OAuth2, since we're using the OAuth 2 protocol, and v2.0. This is the Microsoft Identity Platform. Remember, that's the v2.0 endpoint. Now, there's specific relative URLs for the two actions that we're going to focus on today. One is the actual login action where we go and authorize against Azure AD, and then we'll get a code back from Azure AD that says, hey, this person's authorized. Then we'll go again to the same base URL, but this time going to the token relative URL, and this is where we'll get our bearer token that we can use to access specific services. Now let's talk about that tenant ID. Now you can paste in your tenant ID for your Azure Active Directory tenant, and that'll be just fine. It'll take you straight away to the branded login experience for your organization. But there are situations where you don't necessarily want to do that. So for example, if you are a multi-tenant application and you want to support any type of organization, but only organizational accounts, no personal accounts, you can use special keywords instead of the GUID for your tenant ID, and it will set all of this up. So for example, instead of putting in tenant ID and GUID, I can put in the term organizations, and it'll send me to a login page specifically that tells the user to log in using a work or school account. It won't allow login using a Microsoft account. And this makes it clear to my user that I need you to log in using an organizational account. And then once that user puts in their email, it will navigate them to the unique branded login experience for their organization. We can do the same thing in the personal account side. So if we have a app that allows people to log in using their Xbox credentials, which is how we use in a personal Xbox account. I like to use Xbox as an example because a lot of people have seen that. So it's kind of a pretty simple example. We can go to the consumer's endpoint, which will tell the user that, hey, you need to log in using a personal Microsoft account. You cannot use an organizational account here. There's another one, which is called common, and that's it if you have a situation where you're allowing everything, personal accounts or organizational accounts, and the login experience for the user will be branded appropriately. So somebody was talking about the payload. I'm going to move through these slides pretty quickly because I want to show this off. But essentially, we have two things we're going to do. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to authorize. So we're going to go to a relative authorized endpoint, and we really have, and I'm going to try and use my little pointer here. All right, let's use the highlighter. We have query string parameters because we're going to do a GET request. First, we need to provide our client ID, which is the unique ID for our application registration. You saw that a little bit earlier. Then we need to provide a redirect URI. Where do we want this user to go after they're logged in? Now, you have to specify that redirect URI when you register the application or if you're editing the application registration. So this is something that has to be configured in advance. You can't just freestyle here. Now, the next one is scope. Scopes are strings that tells the Microsoft Identity Platform what you're trying to do exactly, and that's when it will check API permissions. Today, we only have API permissions for user.read, so that's the scope we're going to use. Two more things I think is really interesting. What type of response do I want from this authorized endpoint? Right now, the only value you're going to be using is code, so let's just leave it at that. And then the last one is response mode. How do we want the, once the user is logged in, how do we want to get this information back? Do you want Azure Active Directory to do a form post to your redirect URI, and do you read the form data? Or do you want Azure Active Directory to redirect to your redirect URI and then post all that data in the query string? That's 100% up to you, your stack, and what you prefer to do as a team. One thing I like to call out is there's a really cool extra query string parameter called state. You can put anything here. And when you get your response, you can double check the state is still the same. It's a really good sanity check. So what we're going to do today, we're going to log in using our browser, using all these query string parameters, and we'll get a response. If a response mode is query, we'll get our unique code on the query string. If it's form post, we'll get that in the form body of the post request. So just showing those options one more time in the table. So this is just an example of request. Login.microsoftonline.com. Going to organizations tenant keyword, OAuth 2 version 2.0. Going to authorize. We have our client ID, a redirect URI. We have our scope, which is user.read. This point, in this example, we put a state, and then our response type, which is code, or response mode, which is query. And don't worry, I'm going to actually walk through all this manually, just showing you an example. And then when it redirects back, let's just say, since we said query, it's going to send a GET request back, not a POST request. It's going to redirect to my redirect URI, which in this example is HTTP localhost. It's going to echo the state equals demo, perfect. And then it's going to give me a unique code. It's much longer than this, excuse me. But this is just showing you an example. It'll give us a unique code, and that's code we can use to go get our token, our bearer token, to access different services. Now, once we're logged in and we have a code, we can use that code to get a bearer token. This time, instead of a GET request, we're sending a POST request. And instead of authorized endpoint, we're going to the token endpoint. We still need to provide a redirect URI, our scope, and our client ID. That's all exactly the same. The other difference this time is that we'll have a code parameter. Here, we put in a code for an authorization request and a grant type parameter. This is where we tell what we want. We're going to ask for authorization code with that essentially is asking for a bearer token. I'm going through these a little bit faster because I want to get to the hands-on demo. Just to show you an example, HTTP post, same URI, login microsoftonline.com, organizations, OAuth v2.0. But this time, instead of authorized, we're going to token endpoint, and we're sending all of our data as part of the body of the request. All right, and then our token response will have what type of token it is, which is bearer token, what scope this token will work for, how long this token will live before it expires, and then the actual content of the access token itself. And then if your application is still running and we got past this expiration time, you'll need your refresh token to go back and get a new one. All right, whew, that was a lot of slides, but now I get to show you how we acquire a token. So we're going to use a tool called Postman because I think this is the easiest way to do it. It's just, you can't beat this. So we have our application registration. We're going to open up. We're going to go to https login.microsoftonline.com. Now for this one, I'm going, since we set it up for just organizational account, I'm going to go to organizations. I'm going to go to OAuth 2 version 2.0. That's our base URL that we're going to use for all requests. Now, in this example, we're going to start with the authorized endpoint, which is just a relative URL of authorized. And I could manually build out my query string here. I want to show you something cool. If I say client underscore ID equals, and I go to the Azure portal and I grab my client ID for my application registration, remember it's called MS Dev, just want you to show something really cool here. Notice here in this little table, it fills out this table with client ID and value. This just makes it so much easier for me to edit query strings. I always have a hard time tracking. Did I have enough question marks? Do I have enough ampersands? Well, this will manage it for you. That's why I love using Postman for this demo. So client ID, I'll put that in. If I type in redirect URI, that's HTTP localhost. Let's try scope. That's going to be user.read. Response type, and this is the same exact stuff we talked about in the slides. That's going to be a code. And in response mode, I want to return everything in a query string. Now, here's the cool thing. Now I have this huge URL that's built out. That's all the data I need. So I can just copy that URL. I'm going to go to my browser. I'm going to just paste this URL. So pretend I'm some fancy application and I click the login button and now my application directs me to this URL. Hit enter. And I was already signed in, but if I wasn't signed in, I put in my, username and password. I pre-signed in because I do passwordless login and I don't have my phones during the webinar. So I was already logged in. It says, okay, you're logged in. Here's permissions requested. This application, MS Dev, is not a Microsoft application, so it's unverified. But we could set this up so it's verified and stuff like that. But today's just a demo. We're not going to do that. Here's what we're asking for permission to do: sign and read my profile, and once I give it access to data, maintain access to that data. Now, because I'm an admin in my Azure Active Directory tenant, I can also consent on behalf of the entire organization so that everybody doesn't see this screen. But I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to just say, hey, this looks good. I'm going to hit accept, and I'm logging in. Now, you notice it's going to 404 in a second because it did something really cool. It redirected me back to HTTP localhost, has a query string property for my code, and I'm going to go ahead and copy that and then go into Postman. And I'll show you this works both ways. If I paste in this URL, see this super long URL that it redirected me to? It only has two query string parameters: the session state, which is a GUID, and my code that I got from Azure Active Directory that I can use to get a token. So using everything we learned from the slides, instead of a put request, I'm going to do a post request to HTTPS login.microsoftonline.com organizations OAuth 2, and I'm checking my notes, make sure I don't mistype anything, v2.0. But instead of authorized, this time I'm going to go to the token endpoint. So token. Now, here the cool thing about this is I can go to body and form data, and this allows me to fill out the body of this request much like we did earlier. So client ID, I'm going to go back to Azure Active Directory, grab my client ID, just copy that and paste it here in value. Have my client ID, I have my redirect URI, that's going to be HTTP localhost. I have my scope, that's going to be user.read, all of that's the same. I have my grant type, I want an authorization code, and then the final one is code, and this is where I go get that nice little code we got in the URI, copy that, paste it in. And that should be everything in my request. So if I got it right, I'm gonna hit send, and I'm gonna scroll up so you can see it. I got a bearer token that has permission to use it out, read my profile. Expires in this many seconds, and there's my bearer token. I'll just copy this. Starts with EYJ, so copy that. So what can I use this for? Well, just as a fun example, we're going to go to the Microsoft Graph Explorer, aka.ms/ge. I'll put that as an announcement, aka.ms/ge. Now, this is the Microsoft Graph Explorer. It allows us to explore the Microsoft Graph. I know, complete pun, but the cool thing about it is allow us to get comfortable with the graph. If you've never worked with the graph before, we'll go into it much deeper later, but the Microsoft Graph is essentially a set of APIs and endpoints that allow us to create all of the data intelligence that we have on Microsoft 365. So stuff like your email, the different types of applications you have set up, different applications, like for instance, I want to see all my Excel worksheets within OneDrive. I want to see information that I've gathered from Teams. I want to see things like to-do items, and we'll go into some of these examples in future sessions, but just want you for you to see the extent of the Microsoft Graph. So I go in, we have this graph.microsoft.com/version 1.0/me endpoint, and what that does is that gives us access to the sample user that they have built in. But I can also sign into the Graph Explorer and see the same data for myself. So I'm going to sign in. There's my application. Fun fact, this is using the MSAL libraries, by the way. We go in and I go to graph.microsoft.com version 1.0/me, hit run query, and it gets my profile information with my email, phone number. All this is public, so I'm not too worried about this being shown. So let's see how we do this in code, or do this in our sample. So the URL is graph.microsoft.com. So I should be able to just say get graph.microsoft.com version 1.0 If I hit send, it's going to say, hey, you don't have access token. Well, let's fix that. We can go to authorization here in Postman, and we're going to create a bearer token. Now, it had an old token I had from earlier, so I'm going to delete that and copy this token that we just got from the token endpoint, paste that in. If I got this right, hit send, and there's my profile JSON. So just want to walk you through the three things we just did. We used this URL, and the user, which is me, I went to a browser and interactively logged in. Then I did a post request to the token endpoint using the information I got as a response to my login, which is that code, and I got a bearer token. Then I went to a service. Today is the Microsoft Graph, and one of our future sessions will be services like Cosmos DB or Azure Storage. And I used that bearer token that I've generated in the first two steps, and I was able to create a graph. So it's, really cool stuff that we can do here. Now, taking a step further, I always like to start there because I like the idea of us learning the basics and then moving to the Microsoft Authentication Library. Hey, Matt, are you on?
Yeah, I'm on.
Yeah, I apologize, everybody. I just need 30 seconds. It sounds like somebody is an emergency. Somebody's knocking at my door. That's one of the fun things about working from home.
Okay. If you need to take a break, we'll all be here when you come back.
30 seconds. I apologize.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for your patience. This is definitely a working from home moment. It's the fun of live. The demos have all gone well. It's also where I wish I had hold music.
Yeah, I wish we had hold music. I apologize about that. Everyone had a very persistent mailman who wanted a signature on a package that didn't require one. Yay, working from home. All right, so we learned how to log in manually, and now we're going to use the Microsoft Authentication Library to log in using JavaScript code. We're going to do all the same things that we just did with the manual login, but this time using JavaScript, and I just want you to see how much easier it is. I'm high energy right now to make up for the 30-second break. So let's jump right into this. Gotta find my mouse. There we go. All right, so if you go to docs.com, Azure Active Directory Develop, that's where we were earlier. They have an MSAL overview page, and they talk about all the different platforms that you have the MSAL library available in, whether it's Python, Java, Android, JavaScript, or .NET. Now, if you go to NPM, one of the cool things we could do is we can actually go and pull down different libraries for MSAL.js. Now, there's an Angular specific library and a React specific library, and they're pretty cool because they have little nuances that are specific to those platforms. We'll use those later, but today we're going to use the MSAL browser, which is essentially the vanilla JavaScript version, which is really great for learning how to get started. I saw somebody say, hey, are there other workflows available other than interactive login? Yes, one of the slides we talked about earlier, and you'll see this if you go to our GitHub repo, was on the interactive authentication flow, but that's one of maybe like 8 different options. Wherever you want to have unattended login, device code login, wherever you want it to have situations where you have a console application where it gets all this information on its own without a user interacting with it. There's so many different authorization flows. It's not just interactive. Saw that question just come across the wire. All right, so going from this node package manager, we create this object called a user agent application. And the cool thing about that user agent application is that when we create it, it allows us to create two different types of applications. We have a public client applications and a private ones. Our public ones is ones where we don't have any credentials that need to be secure, and they're great because the user logs in. So when we write our application, we're not really responsible for much anything. Like if somehow somebody gets access to our client ID or something like that, that's not the end of the world. The user will still have to log in, and then when the user log in, they still have to consent to giving permissions. So there's all sorts of ways to there's all sorts of mitigations. But public client applications are meant for applications where you don't have anything credential-wise to hide. The opposite is the private application. This is where you have unattended scenarios where you want to have credentials configured and saved so that, like, let's say it's a console application or a service application that needs to go and do things on its own without a user interactively logging in. Now, I want you to see in code what this looks like. So we essentially create a client using MSAL public client application. We'll pass in an authorization object that includes, and this will look very familiar, our client ID. Now, this one looks a little different. It's called authority, but it's essentially our URL, loginmicrosoftonline.com, with our tenant ID. That's, in this example, it's called authority. And then our redirect URI. So if you remember from the manual example, this is all pretty much the same. Now, we can set it up to cache different things. There's a cache set up by default, but if you want to configure that cache, or if you want to do something custom, or you want to set up whether it's local storage, session storage, you can configure that when you create your client application object. Now, once we are ready, we build a request. The first thing we do is we create an object with our scopes. So for today's example, we're just going to do user.read. Then we can log in interactively by calling client.login pop-up. Now create a pop-up, and there's a login redirect version too if you want. And then passing in our login request. That tells it that, hey, we're logging in. The scope's going to be user.read. On the back end, it's actually doing a lot of the same stuff that we did manually. Somebody asked, hey, does where I get my organizational accounts matter, and which type of Azure cloud I'm using matter with the Microsoft Identity platform? So for instance, let's say I'm doing GovCloud, is that going to impact it? It changes your, I'm going to go backwards just a little bit. It changes your authority a little bit, but most of the rest of the code is almost identical. And there's actually a documentation page on the Azure AD developer documentation site that talks about if you're using like a different type of cloud than the typical public cloud that we use as examples, how that changes things like your authority. And maybe, I believe the authority is the main place is that it's changed, but it talks about the little bit of changes you have to make there. All right. The other cool thing you can do is after you've you logged in interactively, you can take that login response as an account property and pass that into acquire token silently. So this way, the user doesn't see two pop-ups, one to log in, one to get the token. They see a pop-up to log in, and then it silently gets the token. For people saying, okay, what if my application has to access SDK 3 or 4 times? Do I need to pop up every time before we access the SDK? And the answer is no. After that first login, you can actually go and log in silently, moving forward and acquire your tokens silently. So it's pretty cool how these applications are set up. Let's build an application here. So I'm going to go back to the browser. And we have our MS Dev application registration. I'm going to go to authentication. And we have our mobile desktop application. Don't need that anymore, so I'm going to just delete it, save my changes. And we're going to add a new platform. Now, today, I'm going to add a single page application. So this is just vanilla JavaScript. And I'm going to change the redirect URI to HTTP localhost 8080. Now, this is because I'm going to use the npm HTTP server. So this makes it pretty easy for me to point to the same port number. Once I do that, hit configure. And I don't have to save because it saves automatically for me. So pretty great. So we have our application registration updated with a new platform, single page application. And essentially, we're going to go in and we are going to pull down a sample application I built in the past. Now, I'm going to put this URL in the Q&A announcements, but github.com MSUSDev, we have an example static JavaScript app. I'm going to go into Visual Studio Code and go to git clone. I'm going to paste in the URL. And it's going to say, where do you want to clone? I'm going to clone to this folder. Actually, you know what? I'm going to do this on the terminal. I apologize. I forgot it creates an extra folder. So I'm going to go git clone, paste my URL, and clone into the current directory. I apologize. I was trying to use the UI, but I realized it's going to create an extra folder, and I didn't want to do all that. All right, from here, I have my application. It's an HTML file. Nothing too crazy here, just using Bootstrap. So JavaScript file has a run function. When you run this function, it's going to just log running. And if you go to index.html, you'll notice we have a button that has onClick equals run. Nothing too crazy here. Only other thing I want to call out is in our package.json file, we pulled down HTTP server as a dev dependency. And when we start npm start, it's going to HTTP server and enable all cross-origin resource sharing. Okay. Let's kick this off. So I'm going to clear my terminal, npm install to pull down the HTTP server dependency, and then npm start. And it's starting our dev server. You'll notice it's available localhost 8080. So I should just be able to pop a browser, go to HTTP localhost 8080, and everything's running. If I hit F12, I have my JavaScript console open, so I should be able to hit run code and see that has the message running on the console. Everything looks good. Everything's great. Let's implement our code. So I'm going to index.html, and I'm going to add the MSAL.js library, the same one we talked about from npm. So how do I get that? Well, npmjs.com. Remember, it's called @Azure MSAL browser. This will take us to the Microsoft Authentication Library for vanilla JavaScript. Remember, there's ones for React and Angular. And this is the page that breaks down the latest version, all of the cool stuff that we need to know. If I want to include this in my HTML page, I can go to unpkg.com or unpackage. And it says, okay, unpackage is a CDN. All you need to do is specify the name of the package, version, and then the file you want. So let's see, unpackage.com, Azure MSAL browser. The version is, I just want the latest 2 version. And then within there is the lib MSAL browser.min.js. And I don't expect you to memorize that. I just pulled this down so many times I've memorized where it is. Copy that URL, hit enter. And you see this is the minified JavaScript file that we care about that we're going to include in our application. So going back in, I'm going to just create a script, type text JavaScript, source, that URL. I just put in cross origin and hit save. And we now have the MSAL browser min.js. Go to index.js and get rid of this running code and write some MSAL code. So we'll start off with our config file. So I'm going to create a const config. Remember from the slides, we had auth object. So create an auth object. It needs a client ID. It needs an authority and a redirect URI. All right, so this part's easy. Redirect URI is HTTP localhost 8080. My authority is HTTPS login.microsoftonline.com/organizations. That I'm using organizations as a keyword instead of my raw tenant ID. And then my client ID, I don't remember that. So I'll just go back to the Azure portal, go to overview for my application registration, MSUS dev, and grab that client ID. Go ahead and pop that in, save, and that's my config object. So using the same thing that we know from the slides, we should be able to just say var client equals new MSAL. And one of these days I'm going to configure an IntelliSense and everything for this, but I'm just doing it manually. MSAL.public client application, passing in my config object. And now we have our MSAL client. That's everything we need for our MSAL client. Let's set up a login. Same exact thing you saw for the slides. So var login request equals, I'm going to have a scopes property. It's an array. The only scope I care about today is user.read, semicolon. And then I'm going to call await client.login popup, pass it in my login request object. And then I can put put the response in a variable called login response, and I can even console.log that login response. All right, walking through what I wrote. I created a new MSAL client using this configuration. Remember our client ID, our authority, and a redirect URI. Everything that we just saw from our manual login. Create a client using that configuration. I set up a login request using this scope, user.read. I say, hey, login using a pop-up. I'm awaiting that since this is asynchronous action. And then once it's done, it'll have a response object. I'm going to write that out to the console. Hit save. Go back to my browser, go back to my sample application, hit Control F5, just do a full refresh. And fingers crossed, hit run code. And you notice it popped up really quickly because I've already given it permissions, everything like that. I'm already logged in. But just for fun, let's see, I'll go ahead and just want to show you that there's my login response. It has everything I need. I can go in and set up my token. So var token request, just show you same exact thing we did manually, but this time we're doing it in code. Same scope, user.read, let token response equals await client dot acquire token silent. Using our token request as the input parameter. console.log token response. Just to show you that we could call both. So remember, it's going to pop up a pop-up for the login. I'm already logged in, so it's not going to make me log in manually. But let's hit run code. There's my pop-up. There's my login response. It says I forgot my account object. So if we go back to our slides, let's see what I forgot. I have to specify account along with scope, so forget that. No worries. We will go fix that. So we go to our code. We have our scopes. There's our account object. That's login response.account. Save. Go back to our browser, Control F5. Hit run code. There's our login response, our token response. And look what our token has. It has an access token at a property called access token. See all sorts of interesting things. Here's the scopes that are available. User read, look at my profile, OpenID, email. Pretty good. It's a bearer token under token type. So we should be able to just use this right away. So let's just write some simple JavaScript to fetch some data. So fetch HTTPS graph.microsoft.com/version 1.0/me. Now I want to set up fetch. So I have my bearer token header. So I need to create a headers object. And within that headers object, I need an authorization token. That's essentially a bearer space, and then my bearer token value. Remember that was token response dot access token. There we go. Fetch is asynchronous, so I await the response, and I'm going to call this my payload. So the response to call and fetch, that's going to be called my payload. I'm going to do another line. Await payload.json. Now just turn into some JSON data. So let JSON equals await payload.json. And then I'm going to log that out to the console. So console.log graph response JSON. Go back to my browser, Control F5 one more time. Pending no typos, hit run code. And there's my login response. There's my token response. And then there's my graph response with my data from the Microsoft Graph. So we're at the top of the next hour. We have 3 more sessions in this series. I'm going to see if I can skip that slide real quick. And one of the things I'm going to try and do is just highlight that. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to dig into what the Microsoft Graph is and use the Microsoft Graph Toolkit that allows us to take these components, specifically React components, and integrate them into our application without writing any code. Now that we know how everything works underneath the hood, it'll be easy for us to configure the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. So we'll do that in our next session. All this Msi.js code that we wrote today, we're going to take that same code, and instead of going to the graph, we're going to authenticate to different Azure services in our 3rd session. That's where we'll connect to services like Azure Cosmos DB, Azure Storage. And then our 4th and final session, we are going to we're going to use the Microsoft Graph SDK. So today we just fetched from a manual URI, but we're going to use the Graph SDK that gives us really nice classes and methods for traversing the graph in JavaScript. So everything we learned today, we're going to build upon that in our future sessions. Really looking forward to having these sessions with you all. I'm going to hang out for maybe a minute or two, see if any more Q&A questions come in. But other than that, I'd like to remind you that if you've got any questions on this series, that's msusdev@microsoft.com. Once again, that's msusdev@microsoft.com. Send us your questions if you have any questions that we're not able to get to in the Q&A, or maybe you come up with a question, you walk through our code. We also like to remind everybody that our source code is available online. GitHub.com/msusdev is our organization. We have a repo, Microsoft_identity_platform_dev. Everything I showed you today is included in this repo. All source code, all examples. So, feel free to jump over there, recreate these demos, look at these hyperlinks. We really want you to, dig into this, and hopefully, this will help you out in your own journey with using the Microsoft Identity Platform. So thank you all again. I'm people looking forward to the rest of the sessions in the series. Really glad to hear that. And again, we don't see much in the Q&A today, but if you come up with questions, you can access in second and third sessions of this series, or you can send an email to msusdev@microsoft.com. So thank you everybody again for attending, and we will see you at our next session.